Okay, Commissioners, we are going to move 8A up to the top. We have a public hearing and possible action, discussion and consideration of ordinance amending Title 25 and Title 30 of the City Code related to the floodplain regulations. We have staff here to present to us this evening. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you. Am I on there?
Yes.
Yep.
I think so.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Commissioners. My name is Kevin Shunk. My chair is not cooperating with me right now. I'm the floodplain administrator in the Watershed Protection Department. And I'm here to talk to you tonight about Austin's new understanding of flood risk. That's the topic of the evening. I'm going to talk a little bit about what you may have heard this word Atlas 14. I'll talk a little bit about what that is. I'm going to talk a little bit about the impacts the Atlas 14 has on Austin. I'm going to talk a lot about staff's recommended response to this Atlas 14 report. And then I want to touch on the outreach that we've done so far to let you know of the process that we have taken for these code amendments. And then last but not least is I want to discuss the timeline from now until what we have planned as far as taking these code amendments up to City Council. So Atlas 14 is a historic rainfall study conducted by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They're doing this study for the entire United States. In fact, almost the entire United States is already complete. Texas was the second to last area that was studied. The Northwest states are the last ones on the list for the entire country. There are lots of federal, state, and local partners as part of this study. National Weather Service, TxDOT, Harris County Flood Control District, and City of Austin also. What this study is telling us is that Central Texas, Austin specifically, and other areas as well, were more likely to receive severe storms than we previously thought. So what you see there is a comparison of the state of 100-year rainfall amounts from Atlas 14 compared to the previous federal rainfall study, which was done in 1961. Where you see green areas, that means Atlas 14 is predicting a higher 100-year rainfall amount, higher than the 1961 report. Where you see areas in brown, Atlas 14 is projecting a smaller 100-year rainfall amount. Where you see just gray areas, it's about the same. So this is not a statewide issue. We're not seeing an increase in expected rainfall across the entire state. I like to say this, it's along the I-10 corridor. It's the coast, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, all the way over to the west coast there of Texas in Del Rio. And I superimposed the Colorado River watershed on top of this map, and I did that for a very specific reason. Because I want you to note that upstream of Austin, there is not a lot of changes within the Colorado River watershed. There's not a lot of changes to the expected 100-year rainfall amount. That's going to come into play a little bit later on, so we'll have to refer back to this slide. Here in Austin, the 100-year rainfall amount is expected to increase by upwards of 2 to 3 inches. That's a 30% increase just in rainfall amounts for the Austin area. So what does that mean? We're expected to get more rainfall. That means we're going to have more buildings that are impacted by that could be impacted by 100-year flood. That means the buildings that are currently within the 100-year flood should expect higher depths of flooding. That means there will be more low water crossings. That could be a flood. That could flood in a 100-year flood. That means the low water crossings that are currently, we know we're in the 100-year flood, there'll be higher depths and higher velocities on those roads. Overall, increasing flood risk in the entire city. We have about 4,000 buildings in the 100-year floodplain currently. With this new projected 100-year floodplain, the new 100-year floodplain, that number is expected to go up to 7,200 buildings. 80% of those buildings are single-family residential buildings. That's going to come up later on in the discussion as well. So please refer, we're going to refer back to that number. Overall, 3% of the buildings in the entire city of Washington are in the 100-year floodplain, will be in the new 100-year floodplain. 3% of buildings. So it's not affecting a large percentage of buildings across the city of Washington, yet it is impacting those 3% of those buildings. So how do we ensure that new development within the city minimizes its flood risk to itself as well as to others? We do that with floodplain regulations and drainage criteria. So I just wanted to give a brief history of our floodplain regulations in the city of Boston. In 1975, we entered what FEMA calls the emergency program. That was the start of the National Flood Insurance Program. There were maps available at that time. They were crude, is a nice way to say it, but that's all that was available. So we had a crude floodplain map that we started to use for regulating development. In 1983, the city entered the full program for the National Flood Insurance Program, and we had better maps, and we had an ordinance to go along with it. That is the key date of when our floodplain management program started, was that 1983 date. In 2003, we did a small amendment to the ordinance to include the administrative floodplain variance option that was not in there before. Other than that amendment, there have not been any changes in the 36 years of the floodplain ordinance until we have this Atlas 14 proposal coming on board now. This graph shows you the number of buildings that were constructed in the 100-year floodplain by decade. And as you can see, the 1970s were a boom decade to put buildings in the 100-year floodplain. And then what happens after that? It starts to tail off. Why? Because in 1983, that's when our regulations were kicked in. That's when we had better maps. That's when we had our floodplain ordinance in effect. And that number has gone down each decade since then. So we have a three-step process that we're recommending due to this new understanding of flood risk. Step one is land development code amendments. Step two is changes to the Drainage Criteria Manual, or DCM. And step three is an evaluation of flood risk citywide with this new information. There are four main aspects to the land development code changes that we're proposing. I'm going to go over these four quickly here, and I'll go into more detail of each of them later on. The first one is revising floodplain definitions. I'll talk about what that means. The second amendment is including a new exception that we're calling the redevelopment exception. The third change is expanding an existing exception called the Colorado River exception. And the fourth change is changing the amount of freeboard that our regulations require. So let's talk a little bit about the floodplain definitions. The current 500-year rainfall event in Austin currently is 13.5 inches. The projected 100-year rainfall amount from Atlas 14 is 13 plus inches in parts of Boston. Those two are relatively similar. We already have floodplain maps for a 500-year floodplain and floodplain models. We propose to use that information to regulate development while we are producing new 100-year floodplain maps. So our proposal is to redefine the 100-year floodplain in the code to the current 500-year floodplain and use the 500-year floodplain as the regulatory model in the interim period. And I'll explain what that means. The current 100-year rainfall event is about 10.2 inches. The new 25-year rainfall event is going to be about 9 inches. Again, is a close proxy for what the new 25-year floodplain is going to look like. So our proposal is to redefine the 25-year floodplain in the code as the current 100-year floodplain. These definitions will be interim, I say interim because over the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to restudy all of floodplains in the entire city of Austin to create new 100-year and 25-year floodplains. When those models are complete, we will use those models instead of using the current 500-year floodplain. So until those studies are complete, we propose to use these definitions in the Land Development Code. Thinking back to that slide of the state of Texas with the Colorado River watershed on it, remember upstream of Austin, there was not a lot of changes in the 100-year rainfall within that watershed. So we're not expecting within the city of Austin that there will be significant changes, if at all, to the Colorado River watershed. So the floodplains that exist today, we propose to use those during this interim period. Those floodplains are not, we don't see those changing. The purpose of this redefinition is to limit construction in areas where we know there's 100-year floodplain risk. Today, we're regulating to the current 100-year floodplain. If an application comes in and the building is not in the current 100-year floodplain, then staff approves it. However, that building may be in the future 100-year floodplain. So we want to use the 500-year floodplain since it's serving as a proxy for the new 100-year floodplain to limit risk in the future for buildings that come in now before those floodplain studies are complete. Additionally, what that process would do if we did not use the 500-year floodplain is it could create new existing non-conforming structures, and I'll explain a little bit about what that means. So let's say, for example, a building comes in and it is, let's say it's in the 100-year floodplain currently, and it's built to be 1 foot above the 100-year floodplain. Meets code, it's approvable, they go and build it. 2 years from now, we do a new floodplain study, and the new floodplain is, say, 2 feet higher than what it is now, plus our proposed freeboard amount is 2 feet higher than that. Now that structure, well, it has additional flood risk, that's the main thing, but it also doesn't comply with current code. So let's say 10 years from now, the owner of that structure comes in and they want to do a substantial improvement to the building. In order for staff to approve that substantial improvement, they would have to make the entire building comply with the current floodplain regulations. That means elevating the building up and possibly not meeting the safe access rule. So down the line, this could create some issues for these non-compliant structures. We want to limit creating those by using the 500-year floodplain as the regulatory floodplain. So we anticipate there'll be about 7,200 buildings in the new 100-year floodplain. We do lots of great work in Watershed, as I'm sure you know. We work very hard. Our goal is to limit the flood risk to buildings as much as possible. If we look at our 5-year plan, all the projects that we have projected for the next 5 years, on average, we're reducing flood risk for 53 buildings each year. At 7,200 buildings, it's going to take us a long time to reduce flood risk to those buildings. So we asked ourselves, what can we do to increase the pace of flood risk reduction? One of the ideas we came up with was this redevelopment exception. What this exception says is that staff would have the administrative authority to approve a building in the 100-year or 25-year floodplain as long as it meets 4 criteria. The building has to be replacing an existing residential building. The finished floor of the new building has to be 2 feet above the new 100-year floodplain in the interim period, 500-year floodplain. The development cannot be increasing the number of dwelling units on the property. Okay, so if there's an existing single-family home, this exception could not be used for a development that proposes a single-family plus an ADU. However, if there was a duplex on the property and the development was to build a single-family plus ADU, 2 dwelling units to 2 dwelling units, they could use this exception. And last but not least is the development cannot be causing additional flooding on other properties. If those 4 conditions are met, staff would have the administrative authority to approve this development which means it's not meeting the safe access rule. We think the safe access rule is very, very important. And for new development, the safe access rule would remain in place. For redevelopment, to incentivize private money to reduce risk to existing buildings, we think it's a good idea to have this exception in place, give staff that administrative authority to approve development that would reduce flood risk to buildings that are currently in the floodplain. When we talk about dwelling units, we have talked a lot in the past about not increasing density in the floodplain. And typically that has come into play with increases in square footage. At this point in time, we are looking at density as being dwelling units instead of just square footage. So that's why we're limiting the number of dwelling units, that it can't be increased in that floodplain area. All right, so that's a new exception. We're proposing to expand an existing exception that's in the code now, called the Colorado River exception. And that exception, again, allows staff the administrative authority to approve a building in the 100-year floodplain of the Colorado River as long as the building is downstream of Longhorn Dam or on Lady Bird Lake. What we recommend is to expand this exception to include Lake Austin and our portion of Lake Travis. We think that it would be a good idea. It makes it much easier to enforce and much easier to understand what the regulations are if they're uniform across the entire river, not just based on those 2 geographic areas. And the reason why we think the Colorado River should be regulated a little bit differently is because the flooding on the Colorado River is a lot different than the flooding across the entire city. And the best example I have of that is if you remember back when the Llano was flooding and Lake Travis was rising, and there was a time there where LCRA staff projected that Graveyard Point was going to go underwater the next day. And so what did Travis County Sheriff's Office do? They went around door to door and they knocked on people's doors and they said, oh, by the way, it's going to flood here tomorrow. You may either want to leave or raise your stuff up. We don't have that option anywhere else in the city of Boston. So the flooding on the Colorado River is a lot different than the flash flooding we have elsewhere within the city. Last but not least is the freeboard requirement. Currently, the freeboard, which is the elevation above the floodplain that a building has to be built, is 1 foot, except for if you're in the central business area or if you're getting an administrative floodplain variance. Only through a geographic area or a process is it 2 feet. Everywhere else, it's 1 foot. What we propose is to make it 2 feet across the board for the entire city of Boston, regardless of the process or regardless of the geographic location of the building. Freeboard is the single most effective way to reduce risk to a building. We tell people all the time, the higher you go, the better you are. The safer you're going to be, the lower your flood insurance premiums are going to be, so building the building higher will benefit you in the future. So I want to talk a little bit about the outreach that we've done. We started this process back in August of last year, and since that time, we have talked to more than 2,500 people at 88 different meetings. We've done many public meetings to talk to the general public, and we've sent out 24,000 postcards to people in the 100-year and 500-year floodplain so that they could be aware of this process that was happening and also attend some of the meetings. We've talked to neighborhood groups. We've talked to people in the environmental community, professional associations, development associations, and boards and commissions as well. Internally, we've talked to a variety of cities departments in Travis County as well. We're lockstep with them, even though they have done some improvements to their regulations. They're now waiting for us to finish our piece. Then it goes to the Travis County Commissioners Court for their consideration. But we've talked to a variety of different groups within the city of Boston also. So I wanted to bring up 4 things that I think that we heard from stakeholders that we did respond to. And it's just an indication of what we learned from those 88 meetings and those 2,500 people that we did talk to. The first thing, way back in August, that we heard, August of last year, was we weren't far enough along on the DCM improvements. We had some great ideas about what we were going to do with the code, but the DCM improvements had not been projected yet. And that was a concern for the development community. Their request was we would like to see the DCM changes and the code changes right next to each other and going lockstep as far as their timeline is concerned. So over the last 9 to 10 months, we have eliminated that gap, and we have brought the DCM changes on board. We have released the draft rules. We did that about 2 weeks ago, and we're going to go through the DCM process. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. So that gap has been eliminated. The next thing we heard about was regarding building heights in subchapter F. That's McMansions. So if a building is subject to the McMansion rules, there is a maximum building height that is part of the code. If that building that is subject to subchapter F and is also in the 100-year floodplain, we are proposing to increase the allowable height of that building by 3 feet. And I think it says 2 feet in your backup. I changed that. I made a mistake about that. Sorry about it. So that was our response to that, was to remove the allowable, increase the allowable building height just in the 100-year floodplain of subchapter F by 3 feet. We heard some comments about losing entitlements on approved residential subdivisions. And the best way for me to explain that is to talk about an example. So let's say tomorrow a plat is approved and has 200 lots in, okay? And none of them are in the 100-year floodplain currently. It's approved, great. 6 months from now, let's assume our regulations get passed. 6 months from now, they come in for residential building permits. At that time, now 50 of the lots that weren't in the 100-year floodplain are actually in the new 500-year floodplain. So staff would not be able to approve a residential building permit administratively. So what we have the plan we have come up with is that the one piece that they cannot meet is the safe access rule. So we have put into the code amendment that we will review safe access compliance at the time of preliminary plan or plat, not at the time of the building permit, for those that are approved before our regulations are passed. Last but not least, we heard a lot of discussion about the challenges of phased subdivisions, phased developments. And think about a development that is occurring where phase 1 and 2 are built, and usually that's the downstream piece. It includes the pond, detention pond, water quality pond. It includes the drainage infrastructure that leads to that pond. Then they come in and put the next phase in. It's upstream of all that. How are they going to tie in using new rainfall criteria into infrastructure that was designed with different criteria? So not in the code, but in the DCM that we propose, we have addressed that to talk about a way that they can design their new phase with current rainfall, but then also make sure that they're tying into old infrastructure, previously designed infrastructure. All right, talked about the DCM criteria. So the DCM is used, obviously, to design drainage infrastructure. And the Atlas 14 rainfall rates that will be included in the DCM are used to locate floodplains, size storm drain pipes, inlets, and ditches, as well as detention ponds. We are going to go through the standard rules-making process. We've released draft DCM changes already 2 weeks ago. We propose to make the official public release of the DCM sometime in maybe October, November, go through a public comment period and have multiple stakeholder meetings, address those comments, and then hopefully have some DCM rules that are complete at the end of this year. All right, step 3 of our process is evaluating flood risk citywide. With this new information, this new rainfall information, we need to do new floodplain studies because we need to know where that new 100-year floodplain is. Over the next 2-3 years, we will do new floodplain studies for every creek in the entire city of Boston. It's a very huge undertaking. After we're done with that process, only after we're done with that process, do we hand that data off to FEMA and they go through their process to update their maps. Only after FEMA is done with their process and their maps are updated will this new rainfall information and these new floodplains impact flood insurance. So flood insurance will not be impacted at all until FEMA approves their new floodplain maps. In addition to floodplain studies, we have some significant pieces of drainage infrastructure that we need to understand better how these new rainfall rates are going to affect those pieces of infrastructure. I've put on there flood walls and channels. We have 2 flood walls in the city. One is in an area called Creek Bend in Dove Springs, and there's another one on Crystal Brook on Walnut Creek near Johnny Morse Road. We need to understand what this new understanding of flood risk means for those flood walls. In addition, there are some channels that we need to evaluate as well. So as part of that floodplain process, we'll include some evaluation of that critical infrastructure. Again, I think I forgot to put this in your packet. Sorry about that. But this is the timeline slide. As far as the LDC changes, we're going through the public hearing process this month. We'll be going after we are here. We are projected to go to ZAP and PC sometime in September. And the anticipation is to be on the October 17th council agenda for them to consider the ordinance. Step 2 of the process is the DCM changes. Again, we released draft rules a couple weeks ago in August. October through the beginning of next year, we'll go through the standard rules making process to identify comments that the stakeholders have and work those comments out so we can have new DCM rules. The evaluation period, as I stated before, is a 2 to 3 year period, ending up with us handing the data off to FEMA to include in their new flood insurance rate maps. That's all I have. That was a lot. No, that's what I have for you. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Commissioners, this is a public hearing. I want to find out first if we have anyone that wants to speak on this. Is anyone? Oh, you are. Can you come and bring your card up here, ma'am, so that we can acknowledge you? You can go ahead and come forward. I'm going to let you speak, and you'll have 3 minutes. Just 1 second.
Okay, we have Carol Oluwin.
Yes. Do we have a second speaker too? All right, we have 2 speakers.
You have 3 minutes. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm Carol Oluwin. I live in District 4. I served on the Flood Mitigation Task Force as a representative from District 4. Was secretary of the task force and helped draft the final report that we put out. I've also served on the subcommittee of this commission, which is the Drainage and Infrastructure, and have listened to many of the Atlas 13 conversations. This does give me a lot of, I don't want to say confusion, but I guess battle with. I understand the need for the change in looking at the floodplain, but I also want to encourage you to look at what Atlas 14 is going to do to the individual homeowner. For instance, I live in, my house was built in 1957. I live in a 100-year floodplain along Waller Creek. And some of these stipulations that are going to be brought forward by Atlas 14 will have a significant impact on my ability to do much of any improvement to my home. Like, for instance, I still have the washing machine in the kitchen, and my desire in life is to put the washing machine in a utility room that's accessible from the house. But that would become very difficult for me to do. So this does have some impact. So just one flail stroke of the brush to apply this to everybody across the city of Austin. Do think about what it is going to do to individual homeowners and to your neighbors when they have to start to comply with something like this. For instance, my slab built in 1957 was at the 100-year floodplain, so it has no freeboard. And by today's standards, I'd have to elevate my house 2 houses. If we go to the 500-year plane, then I'm going to have to elevate my house 4 feet. And these are just onerous things that the individual homeowner has to face. And I just encourage you to ask questions and consider that as this moves forward.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Okay, next we have Ken Jacob.
Good evening. My name is Ken Jacob, and my story is very much like Carol's in that I was on the Flood Mitigation Task Force also and a member of the subcommittee on flooding that you had here on the Environmental Commission. I live in Onion Creek, and of all the areas that's been hit and has most experience on flooding, it has to be Onion Creek. First was Lower Onion Creek some, I guess, 15 years or so ago now, which was really destroyed. Our Onion Creek in Northside, in Upper Onion Creek, in 2013, we had a flood that came through. Work has been done and is underway right now to buy out about 160 homes. And they're doing an outstanding job, let me say this about that, and I think the way they're going is good. We now, in 2015, had a second flood that came through, and it was different in nature in that where the other had been because of heavy rainfall upstream in Hayes County, the second one was actually a bomb directly over our heads. We got some 16 inches of rain in a short period of time. So we've experienced flooding from 2 different ways. And in each case, we had a lot of flooding. The second one really caught us as far as the drainage system that Kevin was talking about. And that's an important point that I hope will be given a lot of consideration, is because it's going to take a lot of money and a lot of work to take care of that problem and get the drainage system in the city where it needs to be. My problem is simply this. We have in the new proposed Atlas 14 about another 160 homes that come under reevaluation as far as being under Atlas 14 to go into the 500-year floodplain. None of them has ever been flooded in either of the storms, which doesn't mean that they're not at risk. But in some cases, and there has been extensive study that has been done by the HAF engineering group that has looked at our area from all directions, from several different studies, and they're showing that while some of the areas do require changes to go towards the 500-year floodplain, some don't. They've never been flooded, and they really don't stand at risk. So I guess all we're saying is, and asking, is to not do just a one-size-fits-all. Look at the full study, and we've been talking with the Watershed group, and I think that they're looking at doing exactly the same thing. But if you put it in place just as a blanket ordinance right now for us, that really messes up a lot of existing homeowners that can't really do much with their properties because they're then put into the 500-year floodplain. So anyway, thank you. Just please be careful, make them look at everything, ask them to look more carefully, especially in areas like ours. We've had the studies done, there's a lot more information, but they're doing a good job.
Thank you, Ken.
Anyone else here to speak tonight? I need a motion to close the public hearing.
Motion to close public hearing?
Second, please.
Second.
Second by Commissioner. All right. So now we can have further discussion with staff. Do you mind coming back, staff? Because we've closed the public hearing. Coyne and Ramberg have done that for us this evening. All right, so we'll take questions. I'll start down here, and then I'll come over to this side, and then we'll make another round if we need to. I'll start down with you, Commissioner Krill.
So you mentioned, in the map was kind of hard to see. It was hard to see exactly how Travis County kind of laid into the state map. Do you have any kind of Austin-specific map of how the Atlas 14 projections are kind of laid out geographically across Austin? Because there was one thing you had said that part of Austin you were expecting, I think it was 30% additional rainfall. It seemed like, based on the map, my recollection of the map, it looked like it was more in the west and northwestern part of the city of Austin city limits, and I was kind of curious as to how that spread across Austin and what the rest of Austin looked like, and as far as like a percentage. Clearly, all of Austin was in a green zone, so there was some substantial increase in expected rainfall, but I'm just curious to know the kind of the geographic distribution of what's being proposed.
Sure. I don't have a map with me tonight that shows that, but what I can say to that is our current regulations are that the 100-year rainfall is 10.2 inches rain for the entire city. When we look at the Atlas 14 data, it's not consistent for the entire city of Austin. It's not consistent for all of Travis County. It's a gradient change. It's highest in the southwest part of town, and it changes and it lessens as you go north. So the maximum rainfall rate in the southwest part of town is about 13.2 inches. And if you look on the northeast side of town, I can't remember exactly, I think it's about 12, maybe 12 and a half inches. So it changes the gradient changes as you go north. With our DCM rules, we are proposing that we use 2 rainfall amounts, not just one, not 5, but 2 rainfall amounts. One amount for the area south of the Colorado River, one amount for the area north of the Colorado River. We think that is a good way to address the gradient process that we're seeing from Atlas 14.
So are you saying that would be as you're revising the maps or in this interim stage?
That would be part of the DCM criteria. That is the rainfall that developers and the city will use when we're doing floodplain studies or designing drainage infrastructure. That's the amount that will be used for.
In the permanent case?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. On the interim case, we're proposing to use an existing floodplain we have now, the 500-year floodplain.
Yeah. So it sounds to me like we're taking the worst case scenario and extrapolating it in the interim case to the entire city of Austin, and then with the anticipation that we'll move both to new updated floodplain maps and also 2 zones of rainfall for Austin.
And I would say, in general, that's correct, but it's not a apples-to-apples comparison of 13 and a half inches rain to 10.2 inches or 13.2 inches. In addition to Atlas 14 telling us that the point rainfall amounts are changing, it is also telling us that the pattern that rainfalls is changing. So it's not an apples-to-apples comparison between just depths. With the pattern changing as well, that changes everything, and that means you can't compare both of those directly.
Right, the total's changing, but also the distribution across the 24 hours is changing.
Exactly.
Absolutely, understand, and that's what changes the maps, as you say, versus the rainfall zones. That's just, I'm a little concerned that there's going to be this period of 2 to 3 years where, we're going to, essentially anything even remotely close to the flood zones or where the flood zones might end up being is going to end up being untouchable in the next 2 to 3 years, which will only kind of exacerbate our affordability crisis that we're currently in. I don't know what the available land it's going to take away from when compared to the final maps. Nobody can say that, obviously, because the final maps aren't here, but it just seems like we're kind of going a little past in some places and maybe a little more past in other places. And then we're going to pull back when the actual results come in. And I'd like to better understand the impact of that if we have any data on that.
Yeah. Our findings were that we have an option. We can use the 500 floodplain that we have available now, if that's a close proxy for the new 100-year floodplain, or we just wait 2-3 years and just use the current 100-year floodplain, which is 10.2 inches of rain. So our feeling was that it's best to reduce flood risk citywide, albeit maybe it's a little more than what the new 100-year floodplain is going to be, but to use that data because we have the data, both models and maps, let's use that to regulate development that probably will be pretty close to the new 500-year floodplain will be pretty close to the projected 100-year floodplain.
Is there, so, yeah, I understand. I mean, it's an elegant simplicity. I'll say that.
Right.
It's just, without seeing the land area that's being affected by this, it's hard to really understand the true risk at hand here. But is there going to be any kind of process for somebody who might be looking to develop a fairly substantial piece of land to prepare their own models based on these anticipated
Yes.
rainfall zones to kind of say, okay, well, we understand, like on a general basis, this is going to be this is your kind of operating procedure, but we'd like to put the extra effort in to show you that in reality, that's not the way this is going to look.
Yes. So to go into more detail about the definition of the floodplain, there's 3 definitions of a 100-year floodplain. We either use the Atlas 14 data that's now available and tell us what the 100-year floodplain looks like, or use the 500-year floodplain that's currently available, or if you're on the Colorado River, use that floodplain. So there's 3 options. So they definitely have the choice of using the Atlas 14 data to create what the new 100-year floodplain is going to look like.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Yep.
Next, Commissioner Smith.
So this 2 to 3 years it's going to take for this, is it the city who's creating these new flood maps?
Yes, it's a Watershed Protection Department will do that work.
Okay, and so is that going to come out all at one time when it's all done, or will it come out area by area?
It'll be area by area. Certainly, we prioritize the watersheds to be done, that will be done, because we can't do them all at the same time. So yes, we are going to do them in a piecemeal process. That we'll put that schedule on our website so people can see what the schedule is and when they can anticipate new floodplains for their area. And as we go through that process for these new studies, we will have public meetings in the area to share with people, this is what the new 100-year floodplain looks like. This is how it may impact your house.
So I would assume that you, at least at some level, have looked at some of this data that you're going to be doing over the next 2 to 3 years and checked how close that is to this 500 to 100-year floodplain that we're about to enact. So we feel decently sure that it's going to be close. I mean, we're just shooting for it. And I guess I get that we're caught in a tough situation because we don't want to develop further in places that are going to flood. But it's a tough balance here this is a guess, right? A guess at what the 100-year floodplain is.
We have looked at one watershed, not in full detail, but we have done some modeling of the new 100-year floodplain and compared that to the existing 500-year floodplain, and it was a close proxy. They were close. They're not exactly on top of each other, but they're very close. Enough for us to say this current 500-year floodplain is a good proxy. Let's use this as the regulatory floodplain until we update to the new 100-year floodplain.
Okay. And so the new structures that are going to be in these structures that maybe were in the 500 but now are going to be in the 100-year floodplain, how are they scattered across the council districts? Are they in one certain area of the city? And I have looked. I think it's Flood Pro, right, where you find the Atlas 14 maps, and I encourage everyone to take a look at it. But are they in a certain area more specifically that are going to show up suddenly in the 100-year floodplain?
I would say in general, it's scattered uniformly across the city. With that said, though, if you look at the watersheds on the east side of town that are not canyonized and have flatter floodplain areas, the floodplain is going to expand out further than in the western watersheds that are canyonized, where the floodplain is still within the channel or has a lot of topography in the area. So that's the one difference that we may see, but we see additional buildings in the floodplain across the entire city.
That's it. Thank you.
Well, I was lucky enough to be on the subcommittee, so I understand. I was wondering if this would be like if someone is going to sell their house, and the new owner wanted to redo it, they would have to conform with the rules, but they would be able to do it? Or
If land development code amendments get approved, then any building permit applications that are submitted after the effective date of that ruling we would use the new regulations to enforce that development.
okay.
If it's submitted beforehand, then we use the current regulations.
Okay, and also, there was something about the insurance. It's not going to increase until FEMA adopts the rules, is
The
that
flood
correct?
insurance.
Right, so
Yeah.
if people are going to get flood insurance, they should get it before the FEMA rules.
And
are
that is a key piece of information that we're sharing with the public, and we will continue to share with them when we go to public meetings, is that if a floodplain map is changing, FEMA has a process for buying flood insurance before that map changes, and it's very advantageous to buy it before it changes. And we will be educating people about that process so that they understand and better understand what their choices are for flood insurance before the maps do change.
Okay, thank you, Kevin.
Yep.
Good work.
Thank you for the presentation. Just a couple of quick questions. If you could explain a little bit about what the safe access rule is. I'm not as familiar with that as some of the other elements.
Yeah, definitely. So the safe access rule is trying to eliminate islands in the floodplain. So the safe access rule says you have to be able to walk from the building to the right-of-way, all at an elevation that's at least 1 foot above the 100-year floodplain. That ensures safe egress and ingress for first responders to a building. So the safe access rule is trying to eliminate a building that is just raised above the floodplain but surrounded by floodplain waters where the people can't get out, occupants can't get out, first responders have a hard time getting in.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
And then I was wondering, I'm actually really excited to hear about the schedule of kind of rolling this out in different watersheds and having a schedule on the website. When you're doing this outreach, how are you guys reaching, I guess, the affected public? Are you looking by parcel, by landowner? I'm just concerned about maybe people that are renting or tenants that may not be actually owners of parcels.
So we do property owners and utility account holders. So that gets tenants, whether they be in a single-family building or apartments as well. It gets all of those.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yes.
That's all I got.
All right, we'll start down at this end. Oh, we're going to start at the very end. Okay, let me go to Commissioner Macio. All right, Commissioner Neely's next.
Yes, I have just a quick question, and that is, you mentioned that here in Austin, we will increase 2 to 3 inches of rain. And I was wondering, I think it would be good to be able to tell people we're getting this increase, and here's how that happens. So it's a little bit of study on the changes.
Do you mind repeating that?
Yes. Would you mind explaining so that we can tell other people? We are having an increase to 2 or 3 inches. And how did that happen? Why are we getting 2 and 3 inches increase?
Okay.
What's causing that?
So the last federal historic rainfall study was in 1961. Since that time, all the rainfall data that has occurred since then, better methods have been created, more robust data is now available. All of that information feeds into statistical models, and the models then predict what is the probability of getting a 100-year flood, a 50-year flood, et cetera, et cetera. So it's better data, more robust data that is showing us that we're more likely to receive storms, higher storms, than we previously thought.
Okay, so we can tell people, we didn't know the data before, but we do now.
That's correct.
So that's the way we can say
Correct.
it. Thanks.
Commissioner Coyne.
Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate the presentation. I have 4 questions. The first one is, can you just define what triggers redevelopment?
Redevelopment is to a building. Development in general is moving dirt or modifying a building. In general, that's what development is. Redevelopment, in the case of the redevelopment exception, is replacing an existing residential building with a new residential building.
So I guess I just want to make sure I'm really clear, like on the line of like if someone wants to add 2 feet to their back patio for their washer dryer, does that trigger that regulation that you're asking for? Or is it, I guess, is there a line between full redevelopment of a single family home and like a minor addition?
Well, the way the exception is laid out in the draft ordinance is that it has to meet those 4 criteria. One of them being 2 feet of freeboard.
Right.
And so if a property or a building is proposing an addition, yet the existing building doesn't meet freeboard, then that development could not use the redevelopment exception to have it approved.
So the entire building would have to meet the new freeboard standard, not just the addition.
That's correct.
Gotcha. Okay. And then can you be clear with me about what no adverse flooding impact means? Is that watershed adverse? Is that no adverse impact? Has to be how do you confirm that?
No adverse impact guidelines look at floodplain levels, so no increase in floodplain levels, and no increase in velocity that would erode the channel. So it's basically not increasing flooding on other properties, whether that be in the building or on the property itself. No increases in water source elevation.
So that brings up some of the stuff we talked about in the land development code rewrite. We were looking at should single family redevelopment trigger no adverse impact, or is it no harm to your neighbor or whatever. So that's an entire other process that a homeowner would have to go through to get an engineer's stamp to say no adverse impact to be able to get that exception, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Third question. Just want to preface this by saying I'm a fan of the precautionary principle. I would much rather, for the next 2 to 3 years, say rather be safe than sorry. We don't want to impose risk on our community, especially when we know better. What I did want to ask is if you've talked to legal about the scenario of over-regulating someone for 2 to 3 years, and then when we do the more nuanced model, they're now out of what we had predicted. Have you talked to legal about the ramifications of that?
Well, the way we had drafted the definition of the floodplain, being those 3 floodplains that I explained, kind of gives overall that's the universe of what a floodplain could be, a regulatory floodplain, either using the new data, either using data we currently have, or being a particular watershed. And so with that definition being somewhat open, legal is comfortable with that being the definition such that it gives options for a developer to identify what the flood risk is on the property.
Okay. Last question. Piecemeal process for going forward with modeling certain watersheds, which I think is great. Are the impacted homes concentrated in such a way that you could do the more nuanced modeling in the near term for the majority of those impacted by the change?
That wasn't a direct criteria that we used or are using. It may come out that way. It just so happens to come out that way, but our identification of the prioritization of those studies was not necessarily which watersheds have the most buildings that could be in the new 100-year floodplain.
Okay. Is there a reason why we wouldn't do that and we would do it another way?
Well, our feeling was that we placed the priority on watersheds that maybe they're larger watersheds, maybe they do have a lot of buildings, current buildings in the in the floodplain. Maybe we were going to update that watershed anyway soon. We need to do it sooner rather than later. So there can be several reasons why we would prioritize watershed. I would imagine that some of those top-rated watersheds do have a lot of buildings that will be in the new 100-year floodplain.
Yeah, definitely. I'd like to make sure that, if possible, that we prioritize places with the most impact and also places with the most growth pressure.
Yeah.
So look at density of permits and our projection for growth. Yeah.
Yeah, we can definitely include the number of buildings in our priority. We can look at that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Kevin.
You're welcome.
Kevin, a couple of things I'm wondering about. One of them is that, again, I want to go back to that no adverse flooding impact. It's very broad here, number 4, but is it very clearly stated what that will require from the criteria? Is it very clear to that person when they come in that they would need a seal from an engineer stating that they wouldn't adversely impact their neighbor?
So the no adverse impact is defined in the DCM.
Okay.
That has been a cornerstone of our floodplain management ordinance for 37 years. And so the community, mostly the development community, understands what that means, and they understand what is required to prove that. Sometimes when we get some residential applications,
Yeah.
we need to explain what that means and what it entails to get that certification. That's when people learn that maybe they have to hire an engineer in some cases.
Okay, so that was just a concern that residential people might not understand that very clearly, and that they can access that and understand what that requirement will be from them. And so that's just a concern I have. Also, I'm glad to see y'all are expanding down further on the lakes. And my other concern is that it's the creeks that flood us. And so downtown does flood. It has flooded. And we're saying the Colorado, well, guess what? Flows into the Colorado and creates all this other flooding around it. So it concerns me that we keep saying, oh, the Colorado's so stable, when we have Bull Creek that came in and just, I don't remember what year that was, but all our buoys from Lake Austin just went floating away, and we've never gotten them back again. Has to have been 6 years ago. And then we have Shoal Creek, who's very vulnerable, especially right now with the damage that's happened up at that cliff, and that there's big chunks missing there. So are we really taking that holistic approach to those creeks that come in to the Colorado and come into Lake Austin and do some of the worst damage we've seen to residential and probably commercial properties?
I think that we are, because if you look at the regulations, they're geared around identifying and identifying flood risk for our creeks. Looking at the Colorado River a little differently, but the rest of the creeks within the city, Shoal Creek, Waller Creek, the Boldens, Blund Creek, all those in the urban area, those have been identified, and those are as significant as the floodplains anywhere else in the city. The Colorado River flooding is different than any of that other flooding, and that's why we set it apart as having its own exception, a different exception, rather than the rest of the city.
And then if I heard you correctly, and it was a great presentation, and I appreciate all the detail that you had to give us this evening, but there was that some piece where you talked about tying into existing pipes, and as a way to alleviate some of the pressure of the flooding. But so many of our pipes are so old and corroded and clogged up. Is that really a safeguard in your opinion?
So when I was talking about that, I was talking about phased developments. And in general, phased developments are somewhat new, relatively new. And so the upstream drainage infrastructure will be tying into existing drainage infrastructure that was built relatively soon. So I wouldn't anticipate that a previous phase has those old corroded pipes. We usually see those in the downtown area, in other areas that have been around for 50, 100 years.
Yeah, and that brings me to like the South District waterfront overlay that's getting ready to explode. What is that going to tie into? Very, very old pipes, unless they're going to upgrade them somehow.
Yeah, so I would say that in that case, that is not a phased development. That's upstream development that's tying into existing infrastructure downstream. They're not phased. They're not part of a overall development phase. So I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay.
And then, so is the word out for people that are trying to remodel and add on to existing houses and get their last a hopeful piece into what they really want to create to do it now before this happens, where they would have to comply?
Well, we have been working very hard to get that word out. Like the presentation had in there, we have sent out 24,000 postcards to people. We've had almost 90 meetings to talk to people about it. And we had that process, but as these floodplain studies get underway, we will have additional ways for us to reach out to the community to let them know it's happening, to get the word out about the flood risk in general, but also the way that the regulations may be changing.
Okay, good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else? Really appreciate
Yeah.
it. A lot of work.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I have
Commissioner
a
Nee.
quick question, and that is, we've just discussed how the families that are living in areas now that are in the 100% or year. And what was the rationale for saying that the people could not make any changes to their house, even if they can perhaps elevate a certain level or something like that? Because otherwise, we have a lot of people that are sort of just stuck. And that doesn't seem right to me. I mean, I understand the problems, but how do you provide for them some abilities to continue living there?
So there is an existing process for that type of development. That process may include an administrative floodplain variance at the administrative level, and it may include a council variance that we do often. As far as our proposed ordinance, we propose that staff had the administrative authority to approve a development that that reduces flood risk in general. If you look at a house that's, say, 2 feet below the 100-year floodplain, and they want to add on a room and a bathroom, even though the room and the bathroom may be elevated, the rest of the house is not.
Right.
So we don't think the staff should have the administrative authority to approve a house that's not reducing flood risk to the overall building. We think that staff should have the administrative authority to approve it if it's reducing the flood risk to the entire building.
I understand why that makes sense, but people that are living in houses with a slab, there's no way you can lift that part, can you? What do you do if you have a slab?
There are ways to elevate
there?
slab houses, yes. It's not easy. It's not as easy as a pier and beam, but there are ways to elevate slab on grade houses.
You just have a shorter ceiling?
I have a motion that I'd like to read.
We have a motion for 8A. Would you like to read out your motion, Commissioner Coyne?
Sure. Whereas the Environmental Commission recognizes the changes to the national estimates in rainfall intensity, Atlas 14, impact the extents of 25-year, 100-year, and 500-year floodplains, and whereas the Environmental Commission recognizes the risk to human safety and property if Austin does not responsibly regulate development in high-risk flood areas, therefore the Environmental Commission recommends approval of an ordinance amending City Code Chapters 25-2, 25-7, 25-8, 25-12, 30-4, and 30-5 relating to the regulation of development within the 25-year and 100-year floodplains per city staff recommendations outlined at the Environmental Commission meeting on September 4th, including, number 1, revision to floodplain definitions to utilize the existing 100-year floodplain as a proxy 25-year floodplain in the near term until floodplain modeling is completed by the Watershed Protection Department, and utilize the existing 500-year floodplain as a proxy 100-year floodplain in the near term until floodplain modeling is completed by the Watershed Protection Department. 2, create responsible exceptions for redevelopment. 3, create exceptions for properties along the Colorado River based on different typologies of risk, and increase the height of freeboard required with the following Environmental Commission conditions. The Watershed Protection Department prioritize modeling efforts in watersheds with the most impact to existing residential areas and in watersheds where population growth and development pressure is the greatest.
Do we have a second for that? We have a second from, Commissioner Thompson, second that. Any further discussion? I would like to add one other condition if you're agreeable, and that's just for them to continue the public outreach to the citizens to make them fully aware of the new requirements that are getting ready to happen.
Continue extensive engagement and outreach to ensure citizens are aware of pending changes.
Commissioners, Chris Harrington, Environmental Officer. That can be amended if there's no dissent from the rest of the dais, just to confirm.
Yes, and is that fine to amend that?
That's fine.
All right. Any further questions? Ready to vote?
So I
Commissioner
feel like the condition of the I can't remember the exact word that was used, but the exception there was
Create responsible exceptions for redevelopment.
responsible exceptions. I don't think it's quite characterizes it. Like, I do sympathize for homeowners that this is going to impact. I mean, you could have a fairly drastic impact on a substantial number of homeowners' home values, because this is as Commissioner Neely was somewhat alluding to, raising a slab-on-grade house it's possible, but it is not easy by any stretch of the imagination. And frankly, in my opinion, is not feasible in any real scenario. So I really don't view that happening. Slab-on-grade or pier and beam houses, that seems more viable than slab-on-grade houses.
I'm not
but we don't
really
have
willing to consider any amendments to that part of my motion, partially because I feel like the only economic hardship that would come is if someone would want to redevelop or put an addition on, and so we're not imposing economic hardship on people who want to stay in place as they have been, and I'm not going to gamble with increased risk and not do something about it.
But do we know the extent of which a modification to a home would trigger this redevelopment clause? All I heard before was a substantial modification, which is somewhat subjective.
So the key thing to think about is that in order to use that new redevelopment exception, it has to meet the 4 criteria that I talked about. What were they? Replacing the existing residential building, 2 feet freeboard, can't increase the number of dwelling units, and no adverse impact.
Right, but that's if it's a redevelopment, which would basically imply a replacement of the home, right? What about a modification of the home?
So if someone wanted to modify the home and they met those 4 criteria, let's say it wasn't 2 feet above the 100-year floodplain now, but they're proposing to elevate it and add on, and that development meets the criteria, it could use that exception.
So any increase in footprint of the home qualifies as a redevelopment?
It could, as long as it meets those 4 criteria, it could use the exception.
Well, they could use that, but what would be prohibited? What I'm trying to get at? Like, if somebody wants to remodel their home and pull building permits to remodel their home, is that now going to require them to raise their home up 2 feet above the 500-year floodplain?
There are cases where that could happen. Actually, that would be
without increasing the footprint at all.
Yes, there are cases.
So
where
it's
that could
case
happen.
by case, A. And B, didn't you say there's a way they could go and get approval in a different direction?
They could do that as
So
well.
there's also a way that they could go to another, the council you mentioned, to get approval for that.
But I think the other point to make is that as long as this new development, whether it be a bedroom and a bathroom or a brand new house, as long as that development meets those 4 criteria, it could use that exception to get approved.
Well, I'm just trying to understand where the line is of what they can do without having to meet the new standard of going 2 feet above the floodplain, and what they can't do. Right? It sounded like originally it was any increase in footprint, but now it sounds like that it may even be more restrictive to that. Is it anything that requires a building permit be pulled? Or like, where's the line of what triggers this requirement to apply?
So one line that's in the code now and will remain in the code is what we call a substantial improvement. And a substantial improvement is if the value of the improvement is greater than 50% of the value of the building, then the entire building had to be brought up to code. So if someone is doing a non-substantial improvement and that improvement meets the code, then that could be approved. If it's a substantial improvement, the entire building has to be brought up to code.
Okay, so it's either a change in footprint of the existing building or an improvement that represents more than 50% of the value, the existing value of the home.
Right.
Those two things would trigger somebody to have to raise their home up
Right.
to 2 feet above.
Yeah.
Okay.
And to be honest, I think just a comment, that is responsible for us because we also don't want people investing 50% of the value in their home and imposing that risk on themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. It wasn't clear to me.
It wasn't clear.
That
Okay.
specific
Okay.
element, like, you know, I mean, most of
Wasn't.
these, let's say a $200,000, $250,000 home, that is, I would say, more than just a typical remodel of a kitchen or something like that. That
Yeah.
represents to me like a full house remodel. I'm not sure exactly still how I feel 100% about that because there are a substantial number of those that happen in Austin, and therefore there will be a substantial number of folks that will want to do that to houses that are affected by this. And I do see this requirement triggering pretty substantially as far as volume of residential homes that will encounter this. And you know, I think there's going to be quite an uproar from folks because they won't be able to do these things without. You know, again, I raising a slab on grade home, you might as well tear the home down at that point and rebuild. The cost it's going to take to raise a slab on grade home, you know, 4 or 6 feet. It's not really financially feasible.
Commissioner Creel, we have a motion and we need to vote, and you can vote against this if you choose, if you have those doubts, I understand.
Alternatively,
It has
Commissioner
been
Creel could
seconded.
offer an amendment to the motion as a separate motion.
She wasn't willing to
Understood. So as a friendly amendment, is what we refer to them, it's not permissible because there's dissent
That's
on the
right.
dais, but you could offer a specific amendment just to that condition as a separate motion if you chose.
as a separate motion, completely separate. Yes, he could do that.
Yeah, it'd take me a little while to think through what I think would be the right standard to apply there, because I agree. Like we don't want to just wipe that off. The existing residents can do whatever they want with their property. I don't think that is appropriate or right here in this situation. But I think there's some middle ground. I just don't really know what that middle ground is. I think we're putting a pretty heavy burden on a fair number of residents right now, and that's what kind of weighs on me in this situation. So I mean I don't have an amendment without having some time to think about it.
And we just discussed this at a retreat, so if we want to take just a quick 5-minute break, if you want to formulate some potential language, that would be up to the discretion of the chair, but that would be an option.
I'll give him 5 minutes, and we'll reconvene if you want to think of a motion that will help. And also, we have to consider that 50% and what that's going to weigh on a homeowner.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, we'll take a 5-minute break. All right, we're back at 7:58. We have a motion and a second. We have a possible substitute motion coming up to be voted on and see if there's a second for it. And what we're looking at is flooding that will help our citizens, people that are in the floodplain, not in the floodplain. We're looking at exceptions that are out there, a modeling that's going to come back and help clarify more later on with several areas. And are you ready to read your motion, sir? Commissioner Creel.
All right, so I believe the condition was implement a responsible exemption process. Was that the language?
Create
There was any
responsible exceptions for redevelopment.
responsible exceptions for redevelopment. Okay. So I would seek to keep all the motion language identical, with the exception of adding to that that specific condition. That it doesn't specifically say anything about substantial improvement, and I don't know where in this whole change of the ordinance where that substantial improvement terminology comes in, but I would suggest that that the substantial improvement requirement, in order to trigger a requirement for a waiver at all, for the increase up to 2 feet above, that be struck from the requirement and be replaced with no increase in footprint or square footage for the building as one. That would not trigger the requirement to raise the grade of the home. 2, that it must be outside of the current 100-year floodplain. So the logic there being that if they're already within the 100-year floodplain, this ordinance really isn't. They're already at flood risk, right, and substantial flood risk, and this really isn't changing anything for them. So this is only really trying to restrict it down to the people that have kind of a substantial change in their flood risk outside of the 100-year floodplain. And then the third would be that in order for them to not be required to raise their home to grade, they must own their property prior to the implementation of this ordinance. And just want to get a nod from staff on that is a permissible condition. Okay. Yeah, because I don't want people to be trying to buy homes in these floodplain areas and flip them and then resell them. This is intended to be protections for existing homeowners and supporting their kind of individual property rights. I recognize that that could be a bad choice, a bad decision, and possibly a decision that homeowners might regret in the future if they were to invest money in this home that potentially gets flooded by these increased rain events. But I don't think that that's necessarily something we need to be imposing some regulation on them, again, because raising your home to 2 feet above the 500-year floodplain is just really, in my mind, not financially feasible. And so I don't want these people to just basically, their property values to drop to near nothing because of these restrictions being applied. So again, to restate that, the substantial improvement line item would not apply to homeowners that are outside of the current 100-year floodplain that are own their home before the implementation of this ordinance, and 3, that conditioned upon that they do not increase the footprint or the square footage of their existing home.
We have a motion on the table. Just 1 second. Did it get a second? I didn't hear a second. Didn't get a second. Okay, we're back to our original motion. All right, so do we need to restate the motion again, or are we ready to vote, or we want more discussion? Ready to vote? All right, let's call. Andrew Creel?
Abstain.
Abstention. Commissioner Smith?
Yes.
Commissioner Thompson?
Yes.
Commissioner Neely?
Yes.
Coyne?
Yes.
Commissioner Maceo?
Yes.
Commissioner Ramberg?
Yes.
Commissioner Guerrero? Yes. Commissioner Bedford?
Yes.
Motion carries 8, 1 abstention. Thank you very much. We appreciate that tonight.
Thank you.
Kevin, staff, a lot of work. And I'll talk to you later, but a couple of things that concern me with that last one in there about the homeowner.